It's connecting. So yeah, hello and welcome everybody to this IEL Online Forum. Today we have a fantastic panel on vulgarity, which is a topic that's close to my heart. I have fantastic panelists here. Kate Burridge from Monash University, Kristy Fägersten from Södertörn University, and Karyn Stapleton from Ulster University. So welcome everybody. Very happy that you're here, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion we're having today. We're trying to have a look at how vulgarity is used, who uses it, if there are differences, how it relates to creativity in language use, and of course the social meanings of vulgarity. We also want to have a little bit of a discussion about how it has changed over time and what other societal tendencies and processes impact the use of vulgarity. So yeah, I'm very much looking forward to the discussion with our panelists. I'd now like to let the speakers introduce themselves, and basically the idea was that they tell you about who they are, what brought them into researching vulgarity, and also to share one finding that they find is striking or peculiar or interesting about their research and about vulgarity. So I suggest we start with Kate Burridge. Would you like to introduce yourself, Kate?
Thank you, Martin, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. Yes, I'm Kate Burridge, and I'm a linguist at Monash University here in Melbourne. My research interests, did you want something about that, Martin, or... Yeah,
sure.
Well, they're many and varied. I tend to think a sort of jack of all trades, master of none in my case. I started my linguistic life very much in early Germanic syntax. I was fascinated particularly by word order change. And then I moved on to Pennsylvania German, which is, I suppose is my only brush with a living, breathing speech community, or my first brush with a living, breathing speech community. I then moved into Australian English and recently have a project on slang. So we're known as the Slang Gang here at Monash. We have quite a lively project on the ins and outs, particularly the life cycle of slang, which is what interests me. But I did get into taboo and euphemism, dysphemism, quite early, so I've been working on that for quite some time. I suppose most recently, though, I've been fascinated by public attitudes to language. That's because I do a bit of public stuff, and I'm interested in the social consequences of these popular attitudes to language, particularly catastrophic fallout of these attitudes. So that got me into language and the law, and most recently into health communication, actually communication generally, and looking at language around aging and mental health. So those are my many and rather varied research interests. How did I get into looking at taboo and vulgarity? It was actually through my medieval Dutch syntax studies way back when I was a PhD student. I was fascinated by word order change, and I looked at around 350 medical texts, largely of two different dialects of medieval Dutch. And as I was sort of tracking the movement of constituents around the clause, I got interested in how the writers, I suppose, wrote about the things that they didn't really want to write about or felt uncomfortable with, and what were they comfortable with compared to what we're not comfortable with. So that got me interested in that area. And then my colleague Keith Allen was the one that persuaded me we should start looking at taboo and the fallout of taboo, the linguistic fallout of taboo. So that's what that started that. So we did, and I guess, what did I learn? What's my... Well, I think a personal finding of mine was something that I always knew, but I came to really understand much better by looking at these words, was just the power of them. And I say that because I don't think my colleague Keith Allen really understood the power of these words. I did, because you're looking at someone who nearly had her mouth washed out by soap as a small child because I said the word cripes. Now, I didn't know what cripes was. It happened to be a sort of euphemistic remodeling of Christ, but I didn't know. But it gave me this you know, I know that these sensitivities are laid down very, very early in life, and that's what gives these words their incredible power. So what I was fascinated by particularly was the effect of these taboo words on vocabulary generally, a word loss, word addition, meaning shift, phonological change. I mean, it took me a long while, actually, and I'll finish here, but just by saying that I couldn't actually say any of these words. And I remember very first lecture with Keith Allen, and I said to him, I've written about these words, I can't say them. I've never said them, they'll get stuck in my throat. It was an hour-long lecture we had at the Australian Linguistic Society. So he poured me this very large glass of vodka, and he said, you'll get through it. And I sipped through the whole lecture, and well, I would like to say I've never looked back, but I still know, as I say, they still don't sort of tumble out of my mouth comfortably, unless I hit my thumb with a hammer or forget to turn off the bath, which I did once, and the ceiling crashed through into the front room. That's when I realized. So anyway, I'll stop there. I'll stop prattling. That's my story.
From syntax and constituency order to taboo and vulgarity and swearing. Wow, that's a journey. Kristy, what about you? Tell us about who you are and what brought you into vulgarity research.
Sure. First, I just want to, like Kate, just say thank you for the invitation, and thank you to everyone who's here. Yeah, so right now I am a professor of English linguistics at Stapleton University, and I work mostly within the fields of sociolinguistics, pragmatics, and discourse analysis, focusing on interpersonal communication. I look at language in the media, and especially language and popular culture. But I've been doing swearing research since I was a graduate student. So the way I came into it was I actually had a course on sociolinguistics with an assignment to do something with variation. And I kind of quickly landed on swearing because I didn't then, I still don't now, I didn't swear, but I really loved it when other people swore. And so right away I realized, okay, that's variation in and of itself, because I swear or swear very little. Other people swear a lot. Some people are really bothered by swearing. Some people really like it. Some people have particular words they find more offensive or less offensive. So I felt like swearing was just this, hotspot for variation. So I did a little assignment for a course, and then that was it. That was my topic. I just really wanted to, dig into it. And I think what really spurred me was when I'll kind of out my age. This was in the late 90s. And when I started looking at the research that was available at the time, it was still a very new field. There wasn't a whole lot. But Timothy Jay was already, he had a lot of publications already. So he was kind of the one that was doing the most work. But what I was finding is that the few people who are working on swearing approached it as categorically negative. There was nothing good about swearing. And it was always when, I think there was an example that Kate gave, when you hit your thumb with a hammer. I don't know how many people are hitting their thumbs with hammers, but that was like the one context that was always given for swearing. Or you're really angry at someone, or you've been in a car accident or road rage. But there was not the kind of swearing represented that I saw and that I really liked, and that I was kind of jealous of, that other people could do, so sort of casually. And I thought that was really interesting, that how come that kind of swearing isn't represented in the research when we're just hanging out with friends and we're swearing and we're laughing. So I really wanted to get at, the conversational side of swearing. And I think that those are the findings that were sort of the cornerstone of my dissertation. And I think I've contributed to this kind of wave of swearing research where we're looking at the benefits of swearing, what's good about it, and how it can be really important for recognizing the social relationships we have and even forming social relationships. It can be really sort of important to swear or not to swear when you're trying to make, form new interpersonal relationships.
Close to my heart too, like to basically show the positive aspects of it and the power and how people use it in social contexts to form bonds and
Exactly.
take positions. Yeah. So Karyn, what about you? Who are you, and what brought you into analysing swearing and vulgarity?
Hi, Martin, and again, thank you for the invitation to take part today. Yeah, so my background, I'm not a linguist. So I should say that because unlike my colleagues, I'm not a linguist. But I come from a background of communication, human communication. I'm a senior lecturer in interpersonal communication, and I studied as an undergraduate communication studies, and then I did a PhD in psychology and identity. So I think my first encounter with swearing as a topic of academic study was probably during my undergraduate degree when I was researching some journal articles for, I think it was communication in relationships, and I found an article on swearing and gender, and I thought this was fascinating. But then I really just became interested in swearing itself. Communication and interpersonal communication in particular, as we approach it and study it, derives from psychology on the one hand. So what's going on inside the individual when they're relating and interacting. Things like social perception, influence, social categories like identity and gender, but also, of course, the verbal and non-verbal modes of interaction. And through that, I've always been interested in things like pragmatics and discourse and interactional linguistics. So the psychology and the linguistics coming together is at the crux of interpersonal communication. And then we study that broad principles and fine-grained modes of interaction in a range of social and professional contexts. So you can see how in those interrelated areas, swearing was particularly interesting and prominent and potent and unique in all of these fields, from the psychology, the cognition, the social perception, through to the effects on interaction and the linguistic aspects. So that's really where I became interested in swearing, the fact that these individual words, and I approach swearing and vulgarity really as these individual words that are taboo, that are potentially at least negatively valenced, that are emotional, and that through that very negativity or offensiveness can have this range of other effects, and that behave differently from other forms of linguistic interaction. And so that's really my background and where I came to be interested in swearing as a field of research. My own research has been mainly on the pragmatics, the interactional aspects of swearing, and like my colleagues, trying to identify both positive and negative. So when I started studying swearing, it was relatively taboo, even as a subject of research and analysis. I think it's important that swearing is taboo and swearing is potentially offensive. So while I am interested in the positive aspects as well, it's always framed by that negativity. And that's what makes it fascinating for me, this tension between swearing by its very definition and existence is potentially negative, is potentially really offensive, but it can also do all these other things. And trying to unpick those linkages and developing kind of taxonomies, I suppose, of these different functions has been at the core of my work. But also my work extends to things like perceptions of swearing and broader applications in different settings. But also something that Kristy and I have been working on with some other colleagues recently, the power of swearing, which has been mentioned already, and where that comes from. And I was really fascinated with your story, Kate, about having your mouth washed out almost with soap and water, because that's where we tend to think the power of swearing comes from, but we don't really know. And so that's fascinating. Kristy and I and some other colleagues, Richard Stevens and Catherine Loveday, have recently looked at interdisciplinary approaches to this power and trying to understand it. Where does it come from? And we really don't know. We don't really have the research base to say where it comes from in the individual biography. So that's really my background and where I currently am. It's very
because we have like three different perspectives here, right? So the kind of socio-historical, more with Kate, and the social-linguistic, language variation and change with Kristy, and communication and psychology with you. So that's, I think, a very good kind of mix of perspectives on that topic. The first question I'd like to ask you, and I'd like Kate to answer or respond first, is about how vulgarity or swearing has changed over time, and how stable it is, and how shifty it is. So can you maybe say something about the historical contexts or changes that you are aware of?
I think it's always characterized by instability and innovation. There's no doubt about that, because of course we're dealing with taboos. Taboos themselves are dynamic, whatever goes bump in the night for society. So you're going to get change happening there, most certainly. And I think it's also, what we find is that it's a sort of area where you find humor and language play, because that's a way of coping with things that that we have trouble dealing with, as a way of downgrading our fears and the things that are tricky for us. So you're naturally going to get instability there as well. There are huge changes out there. If we just think of the English-speaking world, extraordinary changes and differences, I should say too. If I think of here in Australia, we sort of wear our swear words a bit like emblems on a T-shirt. We put them out there on billboards, government-sanctioned billboards. Just try to stop drinking, and if you drink and drive, you're a bloody idiot. And visitors find that rather odd. And we had that, I always trot out that example of the celebrated Australian tourism ad, inviting the rest of the world to Australia with this kind of invitation. So where the bloody hell are you? And that was an ad that's got, banned in North America. It got censored in Singapore. So the bloody hell was taken off the billboard. It was banned in the UK, which was astonishing. So Keith and I actually looked at, the appearance of bloody in corpora in the UK, and the Brits use bloody more than the Australians do, but then just don't have it out there on billboards or invitations to the rest of the world. So there are all these really interesting differences. I don't know whether I've answered, because you wanted a historical perspective. Did you? I think it's always changing, and of course these days we're dealing with quite different taboos. So if we look at obscenity charges, I can only speak here in Australia, but obscenity charges get thrown out of court routinely unless they are, deemed, what Keith called ist language, racist, sexist, ageist, religionist. So even the full-blown obscenities don't get a look in, but unless they're sort of associated with some sort of, discriminatory language. So big changes there. But I think given that we're dealing with a backdrop these days of, everyone's just so much more laid back, aren't they? So that there's that blurry line between, public and private and formal and informal, which has always been very blurry down under, I can assure you. But it's, generally so around the English-speaking world that, so you're getting informal language, warts and all, out there in the public arena like never before. So there's also that big change that's happening in the world. Anyway, sorry, I'll stop now and pass the baton on to the other two who probably know a lot more about this than me.
Would you like to say something about like the history or changes in maybe the taxonomy or changes of perception or acceptance of swearing? Or Kristy, maybe starting with you, or
Sure. I think if we think about change, like changes concerning swearing, for me, what I think is really important to pay attention to is that we have so many ways now in which we can be exposed to swearing. I think that before television really took off, and you get cable TV and then streaming services and then social media and all the different ways you can view and read and interact with people through technology. Before the advent of that kind of great technological shift, we kind of had media, classic media as our gatekeeper. And so you knew, like, according to the kind of speech that was used in media, what was standard and what was non-standard. And swearing never kind of made its way into that standard, that most public variety of language. And now, as Kate mentioned, we're seeing this kind of seepage that swearing isn't a characteristic of only one kind of language. It's starting to pop up in all sorts of languages or varieties of language. And it's popping up in contexts where it didn't pop up before. And in fact, it was firmly shut out from these contexts. So, of course, I always like to blame or credit, I don't know, popular culture for this. But when we get cable and we get streaming services, they're not beholden to these rules, to these kind of censorship rules. So when you're allowed to swear, you do it. And at first it was, maybe appreciated because, okay, now we've got some authentic language. This is really how people speak. But it's kind of snowballed, and there's sort of this avalanche, and we just have so much swearing everywhere all the time, that it is really difficult to use it as kind of a gauge of what is our context. Is this a formal? Is it informal? Are you allowed to swear? Are you not allowed to swear? So I feel like that's a significant change for me, that it just isn't reliable. We don't have this reliability of context anymore for swearing.
Just
That's a good question there. Oh, sorry.
No, you go ahead.
I was just curious because something I've often wondered about is, certainly here in Australia, anything goes on television, exactly as you're saying, but radio still has much stricter guidelines. They have a dump button, of course, so they can dump swear words, but it's always been much, much stricter. A list of words not allowed to be said on radio, and I've often wondered why. Is it the fact that these words are just there without any visuals, and therefore they come across more loudly, more clearly? I find it interesting. I don't know whether it's the same in other places or.
Yeah, I can just say, well, I actually don't know exactly in America, but here in Sweden, I have been asked in interviews about radio, especially because people really complain. They hear swear words being used on the radio, and again, there's this expectation of a standard level of speech or a standard variety of speech in kind of all media. But I think you're onto something there, Kate, that especially in radio, it's just the words. Like everything else is kind of removed from it, and so all you're hearing are these words, and it's already not expected because you feel like you turn on the radio, it should be language that's available, accessible to everybody, not offensive to anyone. And then these swear words come out, and I think that it does help to isolate them a little bit more, and so maybe you notice them more, and you can't see the interlocutors conversing with each other and how relaxed it might be. It might be this kind of relaxed context that gave rise to the use of swear words. All you have is just the word, in your ear.
Yeah. My thoughts on that, I think you're right, Kate. I'm thinking from a UK perspective. Swearing would be sort of bleeped out, I think, on a lot of radio programs, or if it happened, there would be an apology probably. But I think it might also be to do with the genre of the communication, because often what I'm thinking of at least would be interviews on radio where people are talking and it's not scripted and it isn't planned and it's not expected. And maybe when we're talking about TV or other forms of popular culture, we're maybe talking more about the kind of shows where people might be more expecting swearing to happen more, or more primed to accept it. And we're maybe talking about dramas or more popular culture shows. On radio, often we are talking about interviews, and I'm thinking about on TV, if it were a news program and somebody swore during the news program, and a more serious program, if you like, I think there probably would be similar censorship. But that's just my feeling. It's an interesting topic and an interesting issue to explore further, perhaps.
Karyn, could you maybe walk us through different functions? Because you mentioned that you're interested in taxonomies and you're interested in interactions. Could you tell us a little bit about the functions of swearing or vulgarity?
Okay, so there are lots. And one of the things I think that is so fascinating about swearing is that it has this range of intrapersonal, so within the individual, psychological functions, such as the cathartic function, the stubbing your toe or banging your finger with a hammer, and the just release of emotion. And that's probably most people's primary association with swearing. And it is a very real one, and a very potent one. So we've got this set of internal functions, catharsis, directing aggression, even if we don't direct that openly, but directing and expressing aggression at others, relieving tension. And all of these are internal to the individual. But externally or interpersonally, they can be broadly classified into positive and negative. And I think we've all mentioned, and a recurring theme of this panel will be that swearing is uniquely powerful in doing lots of things. And in the interpersonal context, it has this range of really potent functions, but really varied functions. So we have the negative functions that most people will probably most readily think of. And these are things like, beyond the release of emotion, expressing negative emotions, directing negative emotions at other people, expressing aggression or hostility, or actually trying to dominate or to make other people feel intimidated. Swearing can be a very powerful form of verbal aggression. So we have this set on the one hand, and then on the other hand, we have, I think, the more interesting, precisely because they derive from the potential offensiveness and the potential negativity, we have this range of really quite unique positive effects of swearing. Things like bonding, group solidarity, actually establishing in-groups and out-groups and the parameters of groups and who swears and who has the right to swear within groups and how group members swear among themselves and potentially about members of out-groups. Swearing can be used for bonding as a means of perhaps expressing solidarity against another force. So in some workplaces, it can be used within teams to bond within the team and to maybe express their maybe a negative stance towards management or towards other teams or towards people that they are working with but who are not members of the in-group. It can also be used to, as others have mentioned, to produce humor, to enhance humor, to create verbal emphasis, to create a particular individual style, for example, in storytelling. It can be used, and I think this is a really interesting one, it can be used to actually create intimacy. And the idea here is that because swearing is generally a proscribed behavior and is at least constrained for most speakers in most settings, when it is used between friends or between a group with which one is intimate, it can then be a real marker of solidarity, or rather intimacy in this case, solidarity perhaps too, but intimacy, trust. The idea being, I trust you enough to swear in your presence. We're in a situation here where the social distance is lessened and we have a shared set of norms, so we can swear with impunity among ourselves, and then that gives rise to a lot of other interpersonal and psychological functions. So that would be a quick run through. There are lots of others, but that would be a quick run through of how I would see a taxonomy breaking down. I have mentioned stylistically, just to return to that for a moment, swearing has a link to identity expression as well, and the creation of or performance of particular identities associated with swearing. And speakers will sometimes cite that in discussing their own swearing as one of their main motivations for using swearing, in some contexts at least.
Yeah, so it's not that it's all bad or all just used for catharsis. So it has many social functions, especially social bonding, forming relationships and identities. Yeah. Kristy, what about social dimensions? So there's lots of research that looks at age and gender and other forms of, how swearing is used in terms of certain social groups. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because you come at it from a social linguistic kind of background, right?
Give me a little bit more there. What are you getting at exactly?
Who are the most prolific swearers? Do we see gender differences? Is it restricted by age? What about the audience? What about intensity of swear words? So these kind of things, because you've written about that too, right? So I thought you would be a good addressee for that question.
Yeah. Well, it seems like it's getting more and more difficult to attribute swearing to one particular group. And earlier findings that showed that men swear more than women, or that men use more offensive words than women. Those differences, if there really ever were any differences, are turning out to be more, or we're seeing more similarities. That it's difficult to isolate any one particular, or especially gender, isolate gender as one variable that would distinguish people who swear. So I think that what we can say about social variation is that it's still the case that people think or believe that children, for example, shouldn't swear. And so people will adjust their behavior to try to avoid swearing around children. And it's still possible that maybe some men, or anyone, men, women, or anyone can believe or think that women shouldn't swear, and so their behavior will change to maybe provide a model for how women should act. So maybe someone would avoid swearing in front of women if they think women shouldn't swear, or women shouldn't be exposed to swearing. Or women might think that women shouldn't swear. So if they're around, in a mixed gender group, they might also kind of adjust their behavior. So these beliefs of how swearing should be done, who should swear, we all have some kind of rule. We have some sort of relationship to swearing, some sort of beliefs about who, what, where, when, why, how, and we'll either behave ourselves accordingly, or we'll think about how other people, and try to impose a behavior on people through our own behavior. But I feel like we're, like I mentioned before, that swearing is spreading, and we're really seeing more kinds of people swearing in more contexts, so that we're sort of losing these social distinctions of swearing.
Yeah, yeah. Kate, you raised
Yeah,
your finger.
I was just going to say, there's this kind of, I don't know, particularly regulatory doublethink that goes on a lot with swearing, doesn't it? I was thinking of what happened earlier this year, and Martin, you know about this, where because we had the the Grand Prix here, and around that time, the international body for motoring brought in these extraordinarily, well, whopping fines up to $200,000 for swearing. So they were broadcasting from inside the cars, these cars that were going, I think, around 300 kilometers an hour in the Grand Prix. I think, Kristy, there's probably going to be a job for you, because I'm sure these drivers, I mean, they are under extreme stress. This is either, I haven't listened to any of it, but I imagine it's cathartic swearing or perhaps team bonding, like you were saying, Karyn. But, I think the evidence is pretty robust that if you tell people they can't swear in these conditions, then they're going to get more stressed out and they're not going to perform as well. So I can imagine if these drivers are told that they cannot swear, it seems a little unfair when they're, doing these, an oh sugar or a golly gosh isn't quite going to cut it for them, I think. So I think you could be representing them in court, Kristy, to show the benefits of swearing and the disastrous fallout in this case of, denying these people their swear words.
That actually brings me to a question that I wanted to ask you, which is there's another type of double think in a way. When we think about, we always say, well, it's very in flux and it adopts new members and we're very creative. But when you think about what swearing or vulgarity is, there's a couple of words that always pop up, right? But could you tell us a little bit more about what is vulgarity, what is swearing? How can we distinguish between something that's vulgar or that's swearing from something that's not vulgar, not swearing?
Who are you addressing there?
You.
Oh, me? Okay.
Yes.
Good. The tricky question.
Sorry
I think
about
there are
that.
different viewpoints on this one, aren't there?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, taboo words are kind of, as I think I've described them before, off the shelf swear words. So whatever is taboo in the society are going to provide the society with their swear words. And of course, because these change, then the swear words will change. But there are, if we think of I suppose the ist language that we find that I mentioned earlier, the, racist, sexist, ageist, religionist, the ones that, have legal consequences, certainly in the English speaking world. They don't have the same versatility when it comes to, you can't utter them when you hit your thumb with a hammer or anything like that yet, or, this is early days perhaps. So I don't know that I've answered your question, Martin, but not all taboo words are swear words, of course, and that's interesting.
Yeah.
Or in the euphemistic, well, you have the sort of euphemistic remodeling of taboo words that become the kind of they are obviously swear words in disguise. Their intention is still the same. So you have a desire to drop a swear word, but you don't want to be seen to be coarse. Society provides you with this out in the form of a kind of remodeled swear word, and it's always been that way. And it seems to me, when I've ever looked at censorship, times of extreme censorship and repression, doesn't matter whether it's, full-blown legal constraints or just social niceties, they always just seem to provide this more kind of flourishing, I don't know, more fertile ground for swear words to flourish, if I put it that way. So it usually backfires, and that's where you get, certainly a lot of these remodeled words, and have done so since the Renaissance time. That's when we got the really, interesting remodeled, religiously based swear words.
Yeah. To me, it's kind of that's a discussion that we had too, right? So I'm actually not looking at swearing. I'm looking at vulgarity. And one reason why I looked at vulgarity, why I chose that term, was because I found swearing to be an activity, right? To be a certain act. And I found it very hard to determine when something was actually swearing or swear word. Whereas vulgarity, I found it easier to operationalize, just in terms of determining when to include something or when to exclude something, right? So that's why I typically go with the vulgarity angle and not the swearing angle. But traditionally, we've talked about swearing, right? So that's the terminology that's established in the field. Actually, the time is running because we are already 1:45. It's amazing, right? Time flies. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to close off and just ask everyone from of our panelists to maybe give us a just brief recap, like 1 minute statement about what you think swearing research could focus on in the future, what we are missing, what would be something you are interested in. Maybe Kristy, you go first, if that's all right.
Sure. I'm really interested in how far this this focus on the benefits of swearing can actually go. And Karyn and I have discussed this too, because I feel like I'm wondering, will we ever reach a tipping point? Because swearing can't just be good and get better and better for you. Because if it's only good and swearing doesn't have any kind of negative value to it any longer, then we will in effect not have any swear words anymore. So I'm always really interested in whenever there's a sign of pushback, when people are against swearing and they actually say, don't swear, you shouldn't swear, this isn't the right place for swearing, or you get fed up with how much swearing there is on the radio or TV or news or newspapers, whatever. Because then I think it's really important that we are reminded that swearing is actually supposed to be bad. And if it's not bad, it can't be good. So I'm just sort of trying to keep my eyes open, my ears open for whenever there's some indication of pushback to swearing, because I think that's what's needed. If swear words are going to survive and be sustainable, then they need to retain their negativity, their negative value, their taboo nature. So I'm just really curious about how far they can be pushed.
That's a great perspective. I haven't really thought about that, so that's genuinely interesting to me. Karyn, what about you? What do you think? What is missing, or where do you think swearing research will go in the next decade? What do you think?
Yeah, I would echo a lot of what Kristy has said. I think the nature of swearing research and the development of swearing activity itself across different contexts, some of which we've discussed, means that swearing is perhaps being reconfigured as an activity and people see it differently. And from a psychological and an interactional and a linguistic perspective, that is potentially going to impact swearing. What does it mean, and how does the spread of swearing, the increased acceptance of swearing, and it's not universally accepted, we have to acknowledge that, but it is certainly more accepted in written form. I think that's something we haven't discussed, but I think that's really interesting that in the past, swearing was not generally written down. It was a conversational, a spoken activity. Now, with the merging of interaction types and genres, and in particular social media, we see a lot more written swearing. And I think all of that has an impact on swearing itself. Like Kristy, I'm interested in the impact of that on swearing, and from my own research interests, the impact of that on the role of swearing in interpersonal communication and in a psychological sense. So just very briefly, so I know we're running out of time, our colleague Richard Stevens, who's looked at the pain relieving effects of swearing. So people put their hand in ice cold water and they can withstand the pain of that longer when they say a swear word than when they don't, when they say a neutral word, in essence. But he has looked at a variation of that, whereby people who identify themselves as habitual swearers have less pain relieving effect when they hold their hand in the water and when they swear. So I think if that happens socially and more widely, that potentially has impacts for the very nature of swearing. And as somebody who's always been really fascinated by the fact that a word, a set of phonological elements, can have all of these impacts. In itself, it's just a string of sounds. I think that's fascinating for going forward. Will that change? And if so, what happens? Because swearing is such a inherent human activity, even for those who don't swear regularly or who don't swear very much at all. What happens if swearing actually becomes lessened or not swearing in some way?
Yeah. Kate, what about you?
Well, Martin, I was very fortunate to be part of your wonderful study looking at vulgarity across 20 different varieties of English online, looking at blogs and all sorts of web-based material. I thought it was fascinating I've forgotten how many were, about 600 different vulgar expressions that you looked at. I mean, interested to find that Australia wasn't the top swearers. That was disappointing to most Australians. But that America was at the top, and British English, and then Australian English. Ireland right down the bottom. You know, they're demanding a recount, I gather. And Singapore English fourth. But then it seemed to me there were so many aspects to further explore there.
Yeah.
You know, we didn't, for example, I mean, Singapore came fourth. That's really interesting. Says something for the place of English in Singapore, but also this idea of, you know, I think as some of the people, younger people have said online, it's like putting, you know, middle finger up to the government, being able to use these words. But I think, you know, we weren't getting anywhere near the creativity of swear words in places like Singapore and many of the other varieties we looked at where they draw on local languages. So that would be really, really interesting. And of course, what most Australians are hanging out for, Martin, is how do we fare face to face, you know? And I think you've already done a preliminary study of that. And, you know, Australians and Irish are back on top again. So, you know, I think the context is fascinating there. So why are Americans so comfortable in swearing online? And what is it that Australians don't feel, you know, they might put it on swear words, particularly out on a billboard, but, you know, they don't use these words online. But, you know, you did look at a larger range of vulgarity.
Yeah, that's true. So in face-to-face, Australians are much more relaxed. They use it in registers where it's not permitted in other varieties. I myself, I just submit a paper today about vulgarity in pop music. It's super fascinating because they really see an increase, dramatic increase. You see that Taylor Swift is actually using it a lot. The more she becomes famous and popular, the more swearing she uses in her lyrics. And also I'm interested in how it relates to perceptions of migrants. So I kind of feel that when swearing and vulgarity is used, it forms social bonding and it makes people be seen as peers, right? And when you don't use it, you might be perceived as being an outsider or foreign. So I'm interested in basically the relationship of how migrants use language and maybe how that affects how they're perceived. But yeah, I'd like to thank the panelists. We're now at the end of the panel part of the online forum. So thanks so much. It was really brilliant. Thanks so much for being part of this. And I'll stop the recording and then we'll go to the Q&A if that's all right with you. All right, let me